Michael Hilliard is the host of what is both Australia's best and my personal favourite geopolitical podcast, The Red Line. Michael is a journalist reporting from countries including Iran, Russia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and also has extensive experience operating throughout the whole Central Asian region and former Soviet states. He works with sources from the White House to the Taliban and also serves on various committees and councils for the Australian government. He is a wonderful authority on this moment, and I feel privileged for having been allocated some of his time. He's coming to us from the glorious isolation of Australia's West, and we spoke about some of the following and more. How Michael is making sense of all of this, Putin's motivations, NATO top to bottom, and he also provided some ominous speculation as to where this Russian invasion of the Ukraine could go. So subscribe to the Red Line podcast for amazing cross-sectional takes of various geopolitical issues spanning from Brazil to Syria to Indonesia. And without any further ado, here is Michael Hilliard. So we're recording at 10 a.m. Central European time on the 26th of February. I'm speaking with Michael Hilliard, who is the host of the geopolitical podcast, the Red Line podcast, and also spent many years as a conflict journalist in Central Asia. So, mate, I just wanted to ask you how you're making sense of all of this.
Well, I spent quite a lot of time in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus in this area of the world, and I'm not making sense of this. No one is. I mean, this is I think the big, question mark around this conflict is the fact that, when people were doing the math on will Putin invade or will it not, using logic, he shouldn't have invaded. He wasn't going to invade. The math just didn't add up for him to go in for the obvious and international backlash he was going to suffer for this conflict. But it's something has, changed in his mind, and he has gone in, and it's one of the most horrifying events I've seen. I have friends in Kiev. I have friends over there at the moment. It's a beautiful city, and it's watching these cities come under an attack not only destabilizes the sort of, world balance that we've seen over the last few years, that people tend not to go, walk into other people's countries with full-scale invasions, but also just, sets Russia on a course of being a very isolationist nation, and we're already seeing major backlash towards them. Even Russia right now is performing much worse than we thought they would, and the Ukrainians are doing much better than they thought they would, but it's still very, very dark days for Ukraine.
Can you speculate as to what's changed in his mind? Because it can't really be so simple that he's simply lost his marbles, right?
Yes. So we know he's been, a bit reclusive over the last little while, and he's been reading a lot of history books, and those history books would indicate that, Ukraine has been part of Russia for a very long time, and that for Russia to regain its former glory, because again, Putin and the majority of this sort of upper class of the military apparatus have been, were very active during the peak of the Soviet Union, which was sort of 1983-ish. So these guys have in their lifetime seen, the Soviet Union go from effectively the borders of Germany, or effectively Germany, all the way down to the edge of Afghanistan, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And they watch that retreat. So I think Putin is thinking about his legacy, and thinking about, what he's going to leave behind in Russia. Will he leave Russia as a bigger nation, regaining some of its glory, climbing itself back to a world superpower status? That's, but again, it's that even just how did he not know that this was going to be a much harder fight? We assume that, obviously no one apart from Putin knows what's really going on, but we assume he imagined this was going to be very much like the 2008 war with Georgia, where Saakashvili, who'd been, an anti-Putin activist in Georgia, had effectively talked about reclaiming some of these breakaway republics in Georgia, much like the Donbass in Ukraine. Putin walked in with a bunch of tanks and planes and bombs, and the war was over in, just a few days. Saakashvili just, the whole Georgia just, surrendered and had no choice. And that destabilized Saakashvili, and Georgia went on it lent back into the Russian sphere for a long time to come. And Russia ended up actually coming out of that war in a better position than when it started. We kind of think that he, thinking about that playbook, went, well, this worked in Grozny and this worked in Georgia. Why wouldn't this work in Ukraine? And has just ignored the fact that 2014, the Ukrainians were surrendering in fairly big batches when the Russians came across the border in Donbass. But this is not 2014. The Ukrainians are much better armed, they're much better equipped, and their morale is much higher. So it's a much tougher fight than what Putin expected.
Yeah, that's been a real surprise, hasn't it? Just how remarkable the Ukrainian defense has been. I suppose, according to different things that I've read and heard, there was almost the assumption that the threat of 150,000 Russian troops on the border would be enough to sort of destroy morale and people would sort of fold. But instead, it's a very legitimate resistance.
Yes, it's been very legitimate resistance. Not only have they've been given a bunch of new arms and weapons, but they're fighting for their homeland. And it's very different. When Putin walked into the eastern bits of Ukraine, the Donbass areas, effectively he's walking into areas that are pro-Russian. That particularly at that point in 2014, these are areas that would probably rather be Russian than Ukrainian. Whereas now he's walking into areas like Kiev, they don't want to be Russian. This is a blind aggression. The fact that he's opened up with these airstrikes and civilians have died, and they are seeing this outpouring of world support is just fueling the Ukrainians. The morale's on their side, and they're going to fight much harder for this. And again, you've got to realize that quite a lot of the Russian army is still conscription. So these are Russian conscripts who, Russians will usually have Ukrainian friends. When you go to a bar in Moscow, you're bound to find some Ukrainians there. They're being asked to invade and take a nation who they probably have friends who live there for conscripts, with pretty nasty tactics. So it's no wonder the Russians are going into this with less than stellar morale, whereas the Ukrainians are, willing to fight for their homeland.
Can you comment more on that last point? Because I think that's super interesting insight. The fact that Russian morale might actually be quite low, because isn't central to Putin's whole external reasoning for doing this is that it's some sort of cultural unification and it's a way to really bolster nationalism within Russia, and therefore you would almost expect that would be a big motivation for the Russian army. But I have heard elsewhere as well that Russian morale is actually super low. People don't want to be there.
So obviously there are some Russians who are very happy to go into Ukraine and really, really want to go there and smack things around. But there are a lot of other Russians who have friends in Ukraine and know that this is not a particularly helpful exercise for them. I can't speak for every Russian, but most of these sort of morale-building exercises
Why not?
Most of the morale-building exercises are very much, if you look at sort of the US morale with the first Gulf War, where the US went in and knocked the Iraqis out of Kuwait in, a month and a half with little casualties and won the war, great. Morale was at all-time high. But these long, really bloody wars, when the body bags start coming home, that's when people tend to start going, well, is this as good as we were hoping for? With Georgia, it was a very quick war. With Donbass, it was a quick war. With Crimea, it was a virtually bloodless war. This is going to be a bloody war. And with all the sanctions coming in, this is going to really hurt the average Russian. So particularly last night, some of the breaking news about Germany talking about cutting Russia from the SWIFT network would put Russia in the same category as Iran, where not even the ATMs work. They can Iran barely gets anything from anyone. They have to become an almost completely self-reliant nation. And for Russia, who, it's not the Soviet Union anymore. People actually have Facebook and they can see what's going on. And, people who are used to having Western technology and Western stuff in there, the average Russian citizen is not going to be particularly happy. If you ask them, hey, are you happy to give up all your, nice cars and nice way of life and, your iPod and your MacBook and everything else, and in exchange we get to occupy a tiny bit of Ukraine? I don't think that's a math that most of the particularly younger generation is going to be very happy with.
Yeah, which further compounds this inexplicableness to it all from the outside, and it makes you think that there has to be more going on internally. Apparently, to return to Putin's motivations, apparently he's been quite COVID mad as well, like really isolating himself. People had to quarantine for lengthy times just to sort of be in a room with him, etc. And I heard a great quote yesterday from the editor of The Economist. I forget her name, but she was sort of speculating into Putin motivations, and she said, when our great-grandchildren are reading history books, Putin doesn't want to be a paragraph. He wants to be an entire chapter. He wants the Lenin chapter, the Stalin chapter, and then the Putin chapter. And if that is truly the case, that this is just a legacy grab, it makes it so much more evil.
And this seems like the only explanation we can make sense, because militarily it doesn't make sense. If you look at the aims of what Putin was hoping for, that Ukraine stays out of NATO, then just maintaining his breakaway republics in the Donbass and Crimea would have done that anyway. NATO, you can't join if you've got breakaway republics. If you wanted to keep other countries out of NATO, NATO has never been more unified than it is at this moment. A year ago, NATO, you hit lots of people with lots of think pieces saying, well, what's the point of NATO? It's an old organization that really doesn't matter. Now we're having talks of, Sweden and Finland and even Moldova might have that conversation now about joining NATO.
Moldova.
It's a big if, but yes, Sweden and Finland definitely. These are countries that had no intention of fully joining NATO are now joining NATO. This is really, really bad for Russia. Even the fact that Kazakhstan this morning has said they will not join Russia's conflict here, and Kazakhstan is probably the second closest nation to Russia. They are very, very pro-Russia. It shows that Putin is very isolated in this conflict, and when the sanctions are going to get even worse, when even Germany is quite close with Russia, particularly with the gas demands, it's a major misplaying of the cards here.
So you brought up Kazakhstan there. I'd love to hear you just sort of think out loud about how your time in Central Asia and in the Ukraine as well, you spent a lot of time in that country, how the sort of your time there absorbing the culture, absorbing the politics, trying to understand former Soviet states and how their ongoing relationship with Russia develops. If you could just think out loud about what the implications are for these states in response to what's happening now.
I think one of the major things that you see everywhere, whether you go to Kazakhstan, whether you go to Russia, whether you go to Ukraine, is this weird sort of, when you cut into a tree, you can tell what happened by, looking down the sort of rings. And when you look at Russian society, there is a kind of bit of that as well. When you, for instance, talk to someone young who has only lived with a Putin regime and has seen, the West and been overseas and done stuff, they're very different. So you go a generation up and you get this group of people who are in their sort of 40s now, who effectively all give you the same, effectively the same thing, going, look, Nazarbayev or Putin or Lukashenko or whoever it is, they're not great, but it's not the 90s, and we do not want the 90s, because again, during the sort of end of the Soviet era was a collapse of society for most of these countries. It was, the World Bank said that to transition from communism to capitalism should be done over about a 15-year period. The US gave them effectively 6 weeks. It was such a dramatic shift in society, and it was free for all for a couple of years there. It was not unusual that there'd just be roving, thugs around down the street with guns, because it was such a dramatic power vacuum in some of these countries. People are very, very hesitant to go back to that, and they worry that guys like Putin and Nazarbayev and Lukashenko and Berdi Muhamedov or Rachmaninoff in Tajikistan, all of these guys are so built into the political structure that if they were to die or leave or be kicked out of power, there could be a pretty dramatic power vacuum. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about anything like that happening. Putin in particular, most of the sort of big organizations in Russia, like Sberbank and Gazprom and Rosneft are all picked by Putin. If he were to die, it would be most of these oligarchs who have got to the positions they are, they may not keep their position because they know that the future oligarch that comes in would probably want to choose a whole new set of much more loyal oligarchs. So it's there's an entire system to make sure Putin stays where he is. And also in Russia and all these countries, you see the votes are, there's usually one person who gets almost all the votes, and then there's a couple of tiny little parties that get a little bit here and there. So, for instance, the next most popular party in Russia is the Communist Party. And the guy in charge is Gennady Zanayev, who was the same guy in charge of the Communist Party in 1991. There is no opposition ready. If the Republicans were all to die overnight, there is a Democrat there to step into power. There is just not that system in these countries, unfortunately, because of political repression mostly. So it's very worrying that if this really does, pop off, and Putin does suffer a lot of blowback, and we already are seeing protests in Russia again. And you got to give Russian protesters their due, even though the numbers aren't huge at these protests. They know that the moment they step out, that's it. Like, they will be tracked. So if there's even just a couple of thousand people who are willing to get out on the street, it means that there's many more who are angry at this. And a lot of Russians have not even begun to feel the pinch of how bad these sanctions will be against them, particularly if they get cut from the SWIFT network. Yeah. When that happened to Iran lost about 60% of its economy overnight.
Holy crap. Do you know what that percentage might look like relative to Russia?
It'll be a little bit less, but it'll be around that ballpark. Because if they're cut from SWIFT network, it will drastically reduce the amount of countries they can do trading with. So far, it looks like the only ones who would be willing to do any business with them would be India and the Central Asian republics. But you also got to realize that the ruble has just had a bunch of value cut from it as well. Yeah, the ruble is dropped in value, which makes everything more expensive for people in those countries. But also all of these Central Asian republics, as well as a lot of Russians, keep their reserves in rubles. And if the ruble's worth less, then now their fortune just got cut by 30% just because of one decision that is not going particularly well for the Russians.
You said something really interesting there, how sort of speculating as to motivations for why the Central Asian countries, former Soviet countries, would not want Putin to die because they wouldn't want the chaos of the power vacuum that would come after it. I think that's a really interesting take because it sort of credits Putin again for how effective he's been at solidifying his power. Like, even when he's gotten it such that it's in everybody's disincentive for him to go.
Yeah, it's again, this is not what I personally feel. I think Russia could possibly recover could recover in a post-Putin era, but a sudden power vacuum would be absolutely catastrophic there for a while. And again, it's a lot of people are willing to go through that. They're willing to, if Russia comes out the other side of it with a better leadership, that's great. But there is a large percentage of people, particularly those who lived through the 90s, who are adverse to it. Putin's been very good at making sure his military guys are paid off, his oligarchs are paid off. The people that need to be making money to keep the train running, they're paid off. So if, let's say, there was, Putin was to get overthrown and they have some democratic leadership and they have some, someone who is really, actually a good leader for the country, a lot of these power brokers in Russia who got very rich off the Putin administration would then go, well, I'm not going to get the same kickbacks I got. Why would I pick this guy over Putin? So even if they have all the support from the people, a rival administration may not have the support of the army or the navy or the oil tycoons or the real estate tycoons or the transport tycoons. And those people in Russia have pretty unfettered power.
I wanted to ask you what you made of the Russian and Putin apologists. Because, you see, I've seen quite a lot of it over the last few days, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it as well, because I think you should be skeptical to a overwhelming one-sided argument. But nonetheless, it's a fucking hard argument to swallow. So what do you make of it?
Some of them come from very weird sources. Fox News and Tucker Carlson particularly was a bit of a, where did that come from?
Yeah, that was kind of bizarre.
It's been very odd watching some of these people justify this action. this is because, again, it's very different to what Putin usually does. Putin usually does these kind of salami slice tactics, just move the fence a few inches at a time. And
literally in some cases.
Yeah, in South Ossetia, very much the case.
Yeah.
But when you talk, so when he talks about Donbass and say, hey, these people are very pro-Russian. If we had a referendum, they would want to join Russia. I actually there's that argument to be made. When you talk about Transnistria, where you speak to go, when you go there, people would prefer to be part of Russia than Moldova for the most part. But Kiev, that's a step way in the other direction. This is and watching these people try and justify it is, I guess, because they would either have to admit they were completely wrong, which I think a lot of people do find quite difficult, or go against all of their friends and family. And again, if you have a leaning view of Russian history, and that's a very polite way of saying that, you could justify that Ukraine was part of Russia for many years, and it was only made an independent country by effectively the Germans in World War I, and then the Soviets gave them independent status a bit later on. And it's not a thing I believe at all. But if you had only read those books and you only read that point of view and that's all you knew, and you never stepped outside your bubble, because we do live in an era where you can, you watch one set of television and one set of movies and one set of podcasts and whatnot, and you can be completely cut off with a different set of information.
You never have to hear the other side.
You never have to hear the other side. I also find a lot of it interesting is a lot of the commenters here have never been to Ukraine or Russia. And again, it's the same reason that, you've traveled a fair bit. That the moment you tell people, hey, I'm going Eastern Europe, they go, oh, cool, I've been to Prague too. It's, a lot of people kind of view everything east of Germany as this, well, it's just old Soviet bloc. They don't realize that there is differences between Latvia and Lithuania, between Ukraine and Russia, between Georgia and and Belarus. So yes, it's very difficult, particularly the fact they speak similar languages as well. It's an argument I didn't think people would be making, but I think they are very much a minority at the moment. I think even the people who are on the fence, and even the guys who would go, well, these self-autonomous republics have their right to, decide their fate, and why should a pro-Russian minority be answering to Ukrainian nationalists? Those kind of guys, even a lot of those guys are switching, or very, very quiet at the moment.
I hear a lot about how this is a response to NATO offering Ukraine, or at least encouraging Ukraine to either join NATO or at least be sympathetic with NATO or X, Y, and Z. Even if the Ukraine became a NATO force, in my mind, and this just could be my own sort of, political ignorance, it doesn't count as a threatening move, and especially doesn't justify some sort of invasion, because it's not like NATO's going to invade Russia. Is this a kind of sort of innocent argument from me, or is there some weight to that?
So, this is a sort of, I'm going to give you the not my personal point of view, but what you hear from most Russian officers. Now, when you go into towns, they can be a tiny town of 200 people, and there are only two guaranteed things. There will be a liquor store, and there will be a monument to the Great Patriotic War, which is World War II. They view that war so embedded in their history that it is very difficult for anyone from the West to understand it, because it made such an impact on the country. Everyone is taught that Hitler came from what is Poland today and smashed all the way up to Moscow, and the Russians have always been very, very, very nervous about that, because there's almost no natural obstacles between Berlin and Moscow. It's just flat European plain. So, when Putin was a younger man, when the Soviets were at their peak, you look at the actual defensive lines of the Soviet Union, and they were, well, NATO can't invade through Georgia and Armenia because the Caucasus Mountains are there. And as we know, mountains are very difficult to invade through. Okay, so that's safe. They can't come up through Bulgaria because, well, that's a bunch of mountains as well. We're safe there. They can't come through Hungary because of the Carpathian Mountains. That's awesome. So the only place that, NATO can push from is from effectively East Germany up, which means there's now, 1,200 kilometers between NATO's nearest troop and Moscow. and Russia can take its, let's say, 200 divisions and concentrate them all in East Germany, because that's the only bit it really has to defend hard. You fast forward to sort of now, and NATO is in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which is, the bases in Estonia particularly are a 12-minute flight from St. Petersburg, and there's nothing natural in the way to stop them. With the current defensive lines, Russia now has to defend the 3 Baltic states and has to defend the Belarusian border. And that's a huge amount of territory to defend. So the troops are already stretched. If Ukraine was to become a member of NATO, that would effectively be adding around 2,000 kilometers of flat, difficult to defend territory that Russia now has to station permanent troops on and defend. So it stretches their already stretched forces even further. So Russia then goes, once they're that thin, there's nothing that can stop an invasion. And once you kick off from sort of Kharkiv, you're only 400, 500 kilometers from Moscow. And again, it's difficult to understand for people who don't follow Russia too closely, but Moscow is the linchpin in everything. If you want to fly from Nizhny Novgorod to Murmansk, you have to go through Moscow. If you want to go from Chernigov to Volgograd, you got to go through Moscow. If you want to go from Kursk to Ufa, you got to go through Moscow. Everything goes through Moscow. So you capture Moscow, it becomes really difficult to run in Russia. So again, this is not my personal point of view, but it's something that, a lot of Russian defense analysts go, we need to push and get some distance between us and where NATO is, because they watch NATO's troops get closer and closer and closer and closer. And the moment that Ukraine joins NATO, that's stretching the lines way too thin, and there's no chance of defending the Russian heartland. But saying that, though, Ukraine can't join NATO anyway because of its territorial disputes in Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea.
Okay. But underpinning all of that is the sort of boogeyman idea that NATO would be an invasive force. Like they might literally be an offensive threat to Russia. And I understand, like you just said, if you go to any town, there'll be a liquor store and then a monument to the Great War. That memory exists so fervently in their culture. But isn't also underpinning that memory the fact that it was the threat of Nazism, and there just isn't an equivalent of that in Europe at the moment. And, you could be a fool to say that there wouldn't be in the future, but do you understand what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah,
I don't see why it's a threatening position, even though it exposes them to all of these military weak spots. Why is it threatening that NATO would have any sort of ambition to invade?
Again, it's very difficult to understand, and the point of view they'll give you is that, look, when the Russians put missiles in Cuba, look how much the Americans freaked out, and now we have to be comfortable with the Americans putting troops in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all these other countries, and putting missiles that close as well. The Americans and the NATO troops will say, no, we're never going to invade Russia, and I really do not think they ever will. That's the moment you do that is we're just counting down to nuclear war. No one wants that. But then the Russians will go, well, if you're not going to invade us, then why are you putting so many troops on our borders? And that's where you get this chicken and egg problem. So again, we both know that NATO won't do it. NATO can, at the best of times, apart from this week, pick what color pens they really want to use. But right now, it's, Russia has it in their mind that the world is turning against them, and that more troops are moving in. And the same reason the Americans would freak out if Russia put lots and lots of troops in Cuba. The Russians are going to freak out when the Americans put lots and lots of troops near them. And again, we're dealing with a leadership that's been there since the 80s, since the 90s. They've seen how, in your lifetime, they've seen the NATO borders move from Germany up to Estonia.
Nice. Thanks for that, Michael. That actually does add quite a lot of color to understanding why this might be going on. I mean, it's so far from excusing an invasion, but at least understands, at least informs a little bit of the motivation. Can I ask you to just speculate as to how you think this ends? Does it stop with an occupation of Ukraine, or does it sort of spill out in other places?
Again, it's so hard to pick at the moment. I think Putin is hoping that he can take take Kiev and install boost one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, who will then go, I'm the peacemaker, this war has gone on long enough, let's get rid of Zelensky and we'll make peace with the Russians and we can form a peaceful union between us and rah, 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 rah. I don't think that's going to happen though. Zelensky, when this happened, was under a few scandals. He's been, again, you have to judge Ukrainian politicians on a bit of a curve, and that's horrible to say. But, he's, yes, there is some corruption there, but far less than most administrations in Ukraine.
They're famously corrupt.
But, there was, the fact that Putin's putting calls out saying, Ukrainian troops go and arrest Zelensky right now is, you got to think that he must be getting delusional reports that if he thinks that, the Ukrainian soldiers are going to arrest Zelensky and hand him over. Again, this is a playbook that worked for Russia in 2008, and I think he's misjudged on how much the Ukrainian population would back Zelensky in this one. So it's either going to be a tremendously bloody fight, or Russia will effectively take some ground, hold it, and then go from there. But right now, we're already seeing some fighting in the sort of northwest suburbs of Kiev. But the special forces who came in and were supposed to probably take the city quickly have all been eliminated by the Ukrainian army. So Russia is knowing they're going to have to bring in... See, Russia right now is trying to effectively do what it can to make this a less casualty-filled war, because they need something to, hold back with. Russia right now, if you categorize the Russian army, it's quite often viewed as it's an artillery force with a detachment of infantry. The Russian tactics in places like Syria have been very much it's very easy to occupy a car park is something I've heard from a Russian officer, which means it's very easy to take a city if you flatten it.
Right.
They're not doing that tactic at the moment because they'll be threatening, the hope is that they can do what they did to Georgia and say, look, if you surrender, we don't move to that tactic and we save a lot of civilian lives. Do you want to turn this into one of the Grozny? But their tactics of trying to keep it to a limited conflict, trying to, rather than using, right now they're using a lot of cruise missiles to hit targets, and cruise missiles are designed for that reason. If you're going to use a cruise missile, you can hit a single house or a single hangar, or depending on how accurate they are, you can hit a very small area. Whereas the Russians in the past have gone with carpet bombing, have gone with large unguided missiles. So effectively just running a plane over the top and just blowing an entire block to smithereens, which kills a lot more civilians and will make this conflict a lot worse.
For sure.
That's what we fear, is that the Russians start losing in these small scale battles where they're trying to keep the civilian casualties to as low as possible, that they will move to this next stage of just flattening blocks.
It just turns into a bloody war.
It turns into a very, very, very bloody war. That's what we're all desperately hoping doesn't happen. We're hoping Putin doesn't get to that point, but he's also stuck in a position now that if he actually retreats, if he goes, yep, I made a mistake, and calls it there and runs back across the border, that would be so destabilizing for his position at home. So it's almost now a thing of, is there a way we can find a way to let Putin save some face and be able to retreat? And not have to intensify this war. So, but again, I don't think we should be rewarding Putin for this, because of the fact, if he gets away with this, it will send giant messages to every other country around the world that the balance of power we've had, where international borders do not change by force, will be thrown out the window, and that's something that no one wants to see. So, very, very dark days ahead, regardless of what happens.
Okay, so in short, the ambition is Ukraine. Worst case scenario is that the Ukrainian defense is so effective that it requires Russia to escalate their offense, which would involve the car park sort of route. Is there any sort of threat of spillover elsewhere? Not necessarily invasive spillover, but how this conflict can spill over in other places? I'm thinking China, but not necessarily. Just something that you've seen or read or heard.
So China is watching this very closely and seeing, how the Americans react with this, and taking notes for Taiwan, because Taiwan's in a very similar position to what the Ukrainians are. That whilst being technically a protectorate of America, they're not officially on. The documents haven't been signed, which Ukraine kind of fit in that same category. So if America was to do nothing and say, well, this isn't our problem, we defend NATO, not NATO partners, then China would view that as they're not going to defend Taiwan when push comes to shove. Moldova is very nervous at the moment. Obviously, Moldova has a breakaway republic, Transnistria, and Russian troops are looking like they're landing in Odessa in either, at the moment with preliminary raids and likely bigger strikes to come. And Odessa is only a very small amount away from Transnistria. So, the Russian, if memory serves, the 71st or the 14th Guards that are sitting in Transnistria. Moldova's terribly worried that if these troops are activated, do they push into Moldova and take it while everyone's busy? Or do they get supplied by more Russians? What happens there? Or will Moldova, be asked to join the war and get involved? And on top of that, there's obviously the refugee problem that is already prevalent throughout Romania and Poland and all these other countries. And then if we take a little bit macro from that, Russia has been effectively making sure that these European countries get less and less gas over the last little while, has been reducing the amount of gas they send into Europe, so that there's almost no reserves left in Germany, France, and Poland and all these countries, because there was the hope there that if this conflict did kick off, then countries like Germany would be very nervous to go against Russia, going, well, if we stop our gas imports from Russia, then the whole of Germany goes very cold and our electricity is in doubt, because we've got rid of most of our nuclear plants. Our environmental policies are up the creek because, the whole environmental policy was predicated on using natural gas over a lot of other methods. With no gas in reserves, there was a sort of hope there by the Russians or the Germans and the Poles and a few other people would stay out of this and go, look, Ukraine's not our business. We still need the gas to flow. But the fact that Germany's now even talking, cutting Russia from SWIFT just shows that this was 10 bridges too far, a movement for Moscow.
So in short, you can sort of surmise that Putin has greatly underestimated Ukraine's resolve, Europe's sort of resilience as well to an economic shock, and just overall he's sort of miscalculated this play.
I'd say so. As I said at the beginning of this interview, I think the thing that most analysts, and I was in that camp as well. We all looked at this build-up on the Russian border, on the Ukrainian border. We went, this is Putin banging his chest, which he does all the time. And as we saw it, I went from a sort of like 5% chance of invasion to 10% to 20% to 40 to 50-50. Even then, on the last couple of days, I was saying it's a 50-50 shot, and if I was a betting man, I'd say he doesn't go in, because of the fact it just makes no logical sense to do this. Russians are usually fairly good at making this sort of cost analysis on these kind of invasions. When it came to Crimea, for instance, by sending in little green men to do that, and taking Crimea and not moving any further than the Russian areas, they effectively got exactly what they wanted, that Ukraine can't join NATO, and Crimea, which is incredibly important to the Russian Navy and defense apparatus, without actually having to go to war. It was that, is the cost worth the risk? Yeah, that cost was worth the risk. This is not. They're going to lose a lot of men. Yeah. They're going to lose a lot of support in internal Russian politics. And at the same time, this is going to hurt Russia for a long time. If they have a change in administration, then who's going to recognize that administration? This is not going to be a Georgia 08. This is a whole new kettle of fish, and I don't think Russia was ready for that.
Like we were saying just before we started recording, it's just so ridiculously surreal that there is this type of war happening in our lifetimes. It's something that, I suppose you maybe saw a little bit more up close during your time in Central Asia, but at least these large-scale country trying to take another country. I mean, we sort of would have just read about it and heard about it and watched in documentaries and so forth. Are you speaking with your friends in the Ukraine, and have you been able to get a sense for what they're thinking and feeling?
It's shock. It's weird. Everyone in Ukraine, we were sort of talking right up until, and we still are talking to friends over there at the moment. It was just, they've lived with this de facto war since 2014. They've had Russia do operations on their borders all the time. And, to them, it was when people go, there's an invasion coming, they go, yeah, boy cry wolf, who cares? Not going to happen. Kiev is a city like any other European city. It's a beautiful, modern place. It's, for people who haven't been in that area world, it's very similar to your Pragues or your Germanys or, any of these guys. So to, imagine this very modern, very normal city as a site of a war zone. We're not talking about a country village out in the east of Ukraine. We're talking about major cities in like Odessa, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, big cities here who are now becoming war zones. And this is something we haven't seen in Europe since, effectively the Balkan Wars in 1991. And even then, that was, it was looking like a powder keg. There were people there on the ground who wanted this fight from the get-go. Whereas Ukraine, Ukrainians and Russians, as much as they might, be competitive in sport and whatnot, generally all get along. It's not like, through my travels, you can hang it out with lots of different nationalities. When you go to somewhere like Armenia, Azerbaijan, they absolutely hate each other to the end. You cannot sit at a table with an Azerian and an Armenian. Whereas almost every single time I've ever gone drinking in both Moscow or Kiev or any of these major cities in either of those countries, there is always going to be a couple of Russians at the table and a couple of Ukrainians at the table, and everyone gets along. Their languages are a bit a bit different, but not that different. I mean, look at the two names of the presidents are Vladimir and Vladimir. There's so much similarity between the two nations. But Ukrainians are not Russians. They are proud people, and they're proud to have their own country. This is a hard-fought win they had for them, and this was one of their big things in 1991, was giving up that safety net of nuclear weapons to gain their independence and gain sort of a step away from Moscow. So this is a shocking move by Russia, and one that will hurt them for a very long time to come.
Yeah. And just to add a sort of level of realism to it all, my girlfriend's company, she has a couple of developers in Lviv in the Ukraine, which is one of the westernmost cities, very close to the Polish border. And these are people just like me and you, late 20s, early 30s, software developers. And literally they are being told they can't leave their country, and they've got to pick up arms, and they've got to go and shoot at Russians. And that's so unbelievable. It's unfathomable for me. I just couldn't. And it's just they happen to be Ukrainian, I happen to be Australian. But there's nothing that different about us. These are people that aren't... They don't know anything about military, right? They're software developers. They like playing games online and, going out and hanging out with their friends. Yet, overnight... So, I don't know. It's not a very well-crafted sentence or comment, but...
It brings it home. This is not a...
It really brings it home, exactly.
This is not a war-torn country like Afghanistan. This is not a country that has internal divisions baked in where it's ready to go like a Kosovo and a Serbia situation. This is two, distinct countries with a distinct border who are now at war on the doorstep of Europe. This is absolutely shocking, and again, a very illogical move. The math does not add up, and that is the reason that, as much as everyone goes, haha, I told you so, to all these sort of analysts and academics and intelligence guys who thought that Russia wouldn't go in, it's because effectively the people that thought Putin would gave more weight to emotions, and the people that thought Putin wouldn't gave more weight to economics and logic. And it's just showing that in this case, emotions have become more important than economics and logic, which again is something that can only happen in an autocratic nation. If Trump, when he was in power, or Biden when he's in power now, was to say, let's invade Mexico, there is a whole apparatus of people who would say to him, no, we probably shouldn't do that. Whereas in Russia, looking at there was an amazing press conference a couple of days ago where they're talking about whether they should recognize Donbass, and he's brought in all these generals to ask what they should do. And one of them goes, should we recognize the Donbass? He goes, in my opinion, we should probably think about and Putin stops him and goes, speak up and stop stuttering. Should we recognize Donbass? And it was this terrifying tone. The guy's, I think the best option is like yes or no. Do we recognize? Yes, we should. Which just shows you the level that Putin has of authority over his kind of these senior generals and senior members of staff. It's something that there's always something I really enjoy sort of pointing out to people. Even when Trump, who again was the supreme commander of the military, and it shows you kind of what the military can do and not. And this is not a talk on Trump, but when Trump wanted to bomb Afghanistan with a Moab, which is a mother of all bombs, it's a very, very large conventional weapon. He signed the order on Monday, and it hit the ground in Afghanistan on Wednesday. When Trump wanted to ban the transgender people from the military, sir, we've got to make lots of committees and we've got to do this, and I'm really sorry, sir, we've got to look into this, and there's got to be an impact study, and it actually kind of just fell by the wayside. It just got stuck in committees for a million years because it's not a one-man military. The United States is not just tell them where to go and they go, whereas Russia, it appears, unfortunately is, which is quite terrifying that we are now, effectively deciding national policy on the whims of one man who doesn't even use the internet. He actually has his assistants typewriter things up for him and hand him pieces of paper.
Is that a fact? Jesus Christ.
That is a fact. He doesn't use the internet. That's incredible that it is one man deciding all this policy. Rather than every other country who tends to have an apparatus of people behind things like this.
Yeah. That really does compound on the initial motivation of this sort of recreation of the old glory of the Soviet Union.
Yep.
But look, Michael, that was fascinating, and I thank you very much for allocating some of your time to talk to me.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I absolutely love chatting with you, and it's always great to hear another Australian voice. I have to send you a packet of Tim Tams and some cherry ripes and whatnot, so you don't feel as sad being over in Sweden.
Yeah, mate. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.